Yes. Hello. Hey there. Hi there. Oh there. 28th June. Coughing on cue. Welcome to Dis and Dat. Let's see. Well, today we're gonna continue yakking about capital, of course. Um, what's come to my attention somewhat recently is a not only an extension of what we've been talking about, but the idea that the index, the idea that there's some sort of indexicality at work in capital is a provocative idea and not original. But considering there's a slight gap in discussing it, I suppose it's something worth writing about. Maybe that's what I'll spend time looking at. We'll see. In an earlier article I looked at, we can discuss this valorization issue, but we also were talking yesterday about the walled gardens. The idea that if there is a techno-feudalism, that's what it's come to. In the 21st century, it's not post-capitalism, although there is a discussion of that. The DIEM 25 folks actually have a little group for it, which I may or may not join. So it raises an interesting question. The very fact that the struggle against the enclosure of the commons of external culture can only be practically conducted through concrete political experiments, whose genericity is only truly put to the test if the formal force of collective organization is capable of extending itself to those walled-off places, excluded from the capitalist forms of social reproduction. It seems to endow the communist hypothesis with a possible historical and concrete determination. We were talking about that over here at TAC the other day, the idea that there are places that are less subject to the kind of interconnectedness that the dominant forms on the web involve or engage. It is pretty clear that there are some intranets being created, national intranets. Russia wants one. I think North Korea has one. So this is in the 21st century. I think that's where we can go. But that's just an observation of what we've been recently discussing, post-capitalism, that is. So needless to say, back to capital itself. I came across a couple of moderately interesting articles. And what I've been trying to fiddle around with, and this is where the idea of the index has come from, the question at the difference between departments 1 and 2, production, and a department of distribution, or which might include, in fact, the fact of distribution is a kind of, not only it is commodity creating, but it is kind of market generating or market oriented, which, that's kind of path that capital sort of brought us to, or brought Marx to. And it is that movement into the Department 2 that is Department 2 taking on what happens when production is complete. That is where you have the whatever is being produced being distributed into something that resembles a market, which is not a complete market, of course, but it does engage additional processes. In other words, unless you're an auto company like GM, where you have your own bank, some of those kinds of exchanges, the creation and formation of a commodity is sort of transformed. You still have to pay for the raw materials and the workers, etc. And so there is this smaller internal market, B2B, we could call it, in the 20th century. And that's kind of what we're going to look at, I guess. I came across a couple of new articles, and the first one, let me just quote Marx: "Capital, in contrast, does not come out of the process as it entered it. It is in the process that it is first converted into actual capital, into self-valorising value," hence the title. "The total product is now the form in which capital exists as realized capital, and as such, it again confronts labor as the property of the capitalist, as a power which is independent and has been created by labor itself. Hence, the production process was not only its reproduction process, but its process of production as capital. Previously, the conditions of production confronted the workers as capital insofar as he found them to be present over against him in independence. Now it is the product of his own labor that he finds confronting him as conditions of production that have been converted into capital. What started as a presupposition is now the result of the production process. Saying that the production process creates capital is only another way of saying that it has created surplus value. And this is one of those interesting moments where you sort of want to think, well, Marx has kind of got all this together. It's a whole bunch of interpreters that have caused the problem. Kind of where we are with the recent national debate in the US. Many current social movement struggles are being informed by a diverse new range of leftist theory, breaking the hold that orthodox Marxism once had on political action and concentrating theoretically on the sphere of reproduction in the building of resistance to capitalism has been essential to the increasing diversity of reflexive thinking within many of these struggles. This has taken many forms, from social movement unionism to disruptive struggles that seek concession from the state and capital, to the broadly territorial movements building a new commons. All those things I would assume sort of you could think about happening now. It's from an article in Interface by Jared Sachs, rethinking surplus value, recentering struggle at the sphere of reproduction. So you can see all those things at work. Yeah, on the one hand, you have production, and a production is bias. And there's been the expression of what happens after that, the things that are brought up in volume 2. What things get reproduced, what things become ultimately realized. And then as they become realized, how is it that surplus value gets created? These metaphors, however, hardly do justice to the regularity and conceptual subtlety of we as theorists and social actors actually do with this ideological distinction. It's an article on public and private. Public and private do not simply describe the social world in any direct way. They are rather tools for arguments about and in that world. Hence, to understand the persistence of the dichotomy and our sense of its constancy, despite dramatic changes, we need an account of how it operates as ideological communication. Drawing on a Peircean, yes, we've been talking about Charles Sanders Peirce and semiotics, and yes, there's jargon, but we tried to keep it to a minimum. As I've discussed before, indexical things are an example of a certain type of contiguity. That is, something by association helps bring the meaning to a particular message, whereas icons combine the things in the thing itself. So even a religious icon is not an original, is not just an object. It is rather, a spirituality itself embodied, congealed in the object. That's how iconography originally was designed. You had an illiterate populace who would come to church and would be affected without having to have text of any kind accompany it, or having a priest be the only interpreter, as it were, the deliverer of the message, the word, in that particular context. So the iconography is there sitting next to you with like a big cartoon or a mural to help you out with the imagery if you lack the imagination of the religious activity. So drawing on a Persian semiotics is developed within linguistic anthropology. And there is a move in anthropology to integrate studies of language and culture and to bring them together. It's another feature of the 19th century. It's all these things being brought together. Not only did we have science and natural history, but certainly cultural history of a certain kind. And for some people, it has become currently problematic. But, after all, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, and dinosaurs. Oh, my. I suggest we look for the indexical properties of the public-private distinction. This will reveal that its referential content, the things to which it refers, always relies on context. We mentioned that yesterday. That is, introducing an indexical word or feature requires context. So it cannot be contextless. So context of use, and that there's a pragmatic component, and that the distinction is relative to those contexts. By using the public-private dichotomy, participants can subdivide, recalibrate, and thus make fractal recursions. This is where it gets crazy. A fractal is a kind of mathematical sort of feature that creates complexity within itself. The simple example, I hope you'll think it's simple. Recall that there is a Star Trek movie that includes something called the Genesis effect. It also includes Noonien Khan. But anyway, aside from that, the Genesis project, which is terraforming of a planet, the technology in order to do the computer generated graphics depended on fractal math. That the idea of a fractal math is not unlike the Norwegian fjord, is that you could say that a coastline is really much longer than you think it is, because it's doing all these little sort of ins and outs and whatever. The fjord itself is that kind of in and out. That so the length of a coastline is, with all of these little ins and outs and inlets and waterways and rivers and creeks and blah blah blah, the coastline itself is much more detailed. Now, that's just in terms of a coastline. If you apply this in a more dimensional way, fractal geometry can generate land features, because at a certain degree of perception, you begin to take all these little fine mathematical things and generalize them to a certain shape. So you could actually create mountains and coastlines and hills and valleys and blah, blah, blah. And so the computer generated imagery in the second Star Trek movie, Wrath of Khan, it has a sequence where a terraformed planet is made using computer generated imagery that is based on fractal geometry. So that little digression aside, fractal recursions in their categorizations of cultural objects and personae. A Persian approach also suggests that we can understand ideologies as meta discourses, that is, theoretical discourses that comment on and regiment other communicative practices. Only when a practice is labeled and named is it regimented referentially, thereby becoming relatively easy to discuss as a social reality. By contrast, that's forest for the trees, in other words. By contrast, fractal subdivisions enacted by participants through indexical signs are often hard to notice, even for the social actors who use and impose them. So a fractal division, in other words, helps describe the kind of inferences that we make that are often much more nonverbal or subtle or, you know, for example, last night, I think what was interesting, or the reverse spin, as it were, was that I think a lot more people were, because Trump defaulted to his essential, the little tropes he uses in his rally speeches, the lies that he generates, the conspiracy theories and catchphrases and such. He integrated that all into his responses. So essentially, he was giving a rally speech last night, and a lot of people, I think, are more convinced that he's just an outright liar and just a terrible person. So anyway, that's the kind of subtlety that some people are trying to at least generate. Okay, so a semiotic approach to public and private suggests that, contrary to customary scholarly parlance and common sense usage, public and private are not particular places, domains, spheres of activity, or even types of interaction. Even less are they distinctive institutions or practices. Public and private are co-constitutive cultural categories, as many have pointed out, but they're also, and equally importantly, indexical signs that are always relative, dependent for part of their referential meaning on the interactional context on which they are used. First, then, the public-private dichotomy is best understood as a discursive phenomenon that once established can be used to characterize, categorize, organize, and contrast virtually any kind of social fact. That is, spaces, institutions, bodies, groups, activities, interactions, relations. Lest you think that's unimportant, the guy who failed, I think, no, I think he's still running, yes, for governor of North Carolina, was one of the original authors of a bathroom law that required that you have to carry an ID, a government ID, in order to use the toilet, which is pretty interesting. Second, the historical creation of a distinction between public and private is not dependent on the use of these or even parallel lexical items, that is, words, although for historical reasons, cognates of the English terms are frequent all over Europe and post-colonial regions as well. Le hot dog, no, and that's not true. Rather, the historically locatable process of developing these categories into politically and economically significant distinctions appropriates or is parasitic on the much more widespread pragmatic possibility of using in interaction a variety of indexical signals for more proximate versus more distanced relationships or events. Linguistic resources for doing this are the deictics such as here and there, as well as changes in gesture, posture, and what Bakhtin called voicing. Mikhail Bakhtin is I don't know if he really called himself a semiotician, but he's popular within the context of literary criticism and semiotics for giving us certain ideas about the multiple possibilities or meanings of words, sort of expanding the semantic universe for words, something called heteroglossia. Anyway, the ideological distinction is a meta-commentary that regiments practices, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, mapping on them a grid of interpretation. This is this idea that you have, remember, we've been looking at internal versus external, right? Endogenous versus exogenous relationships. Deictics and other indexicals often use the speaker's body as an orienting center. So, things are in front of me and behind me, to the left, to the right, here, there, etc. As an orienting center, so that far from being merely discourse, these processes of pointing away from self and towards self through speech have a strong materiality. Yes, this is something I was amused about in graduate school, how is it that we can deconstruct or reconstruct space using things that were more indexical, like language, for example. even when recruited through meta-discursive commentary for grand political projects, they remain available for creating embodied subjectivities like the border, right? Southern border, it's them or us. They're on the other side. They're trying to get here, blah, 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 right? And yet the border is, it's not a wall. It's never a wall. You can get through that wall anyway, a physical wall, they bored holes in them. They have speed contests to go over the wall. It's not a real wall in that sense. So it is both, a wall in the mind, as was created by the Trump administration, and walls in reality. Third, and most important for my purposes here, the public-private dichotomy is what some of us in theorizing processes of social, cultural, and linguistic differentiation have called a fractal distinction. Darn, more jargon. This means that it's a particular kind of indexical. Whatever the local, historically specific content of the dichotomy, the distinction between public and private can be reproduced repeatedly by projecting it onto narrower contexts or broader ones. Or it can be projected onto different social objects, like I just called the wall, the southern border wall of the United States, that isn't really a wall, and it's not a single wall, and it's only a metaphorical wall used in some cases to raise money. Steve Bannon was, in fact, pardoned from the crime of trying to grift off of that, or he misused the money that he appropriated from donors who wanted to build their own wall, not even the government's wall, but their own wall. But anyway, or privately funded wall. Activities, identities, institutions, spaces, and interactions that can be further categorized into private and public parts. Then, through recursivity and recalibration, each of these parts can be recategorized again by the same public-private distinction. It is crucial that such calibrations are always relative positions and not properties laminated onto the person's objects or spaces concerned. They are like Bakhtinian voicings or perspectives rather than fixed categories. Bakhtin talked about it as a kind of multivocative, that there are multiple voices in the semantic meanings of various signs. The term fractal is used in geometry to describe how a single pattern recurs inside itself, is self-similar. It's imagine anyway, that I won't go there. Self-similar, often with multiple.
A good example of a fractal is a fern leaf.
Yes. Okay. That's good. Excellent.
Fern leaf. You look closely, and it's basically the same geometry within itself, within itself, within itself.
Right. Thank you very much. That fractals appear in nature, and that's that whole business that you can computer generate imagery that replicates that same kind of generalization that we get when we view things in nature. You look at a hill and it looks like it has a single edge at distance, but when you get closer, it's all these rocks and trees and blah, 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 blah. So there is this moment of resolution, you could say, often with multiple nestings, but some venerable works in social science, such as the analysis of segmentary lineages in anthropology, have also replicated this logic without the handy fractal label. Well, I don't know if it's handy, if it's, problematic. But anyway, in all these, skip ahead, in all these examples of spaces, types of work, and institutions, there is no simple continuum, of public to private. No funding agencies, for instance, are more public or more private. And in fact, that's the problem. Public-private partnerships invariably are asymmetrical and usually in favor of private profit. Each is one or the other, a semiotics of the public-private distinction by law. Nor are some forms of paid work more paid than others, although some are surely more lucrative. Here, as with the earlier example of bourgeois spaces, the issue is not one of unstable or fuzzy boundaries. Rather, the intertwining public and private is created by practices that participants understand as recreations of the dichotomy. Yet, in part because these separations are indexical, participants can often collapse them into a single dichotomy, simplifying what is, in practice, complexly recursive forest for the trees, for example. So that's from an article in the Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies. Yes, I didn't mention any feminism in there. I took out what was, I think, the useful theoretical part, but that's how it can be. Just you can burrow down into a distinction on semiotics of public-private distinction. It's an article by Susan Gall in a journal called Differences, with all those dashes between the letters. And so what I would propose is that at one level, there's a fuzzy logic for example, dialectical materialism. So I asked Gemini, the AI that Google has, what is the relationship of self-valorizing capital and modern monetary theory? And of course, it defaulted to, I can't quite do that synthesis, but here's the connection I can make. So Gemini said, self-valorizing capital and modern monetary theory, MMT, come from very different schools of economic thought, and they don't directly connect in the traditional sense. Here's a breakdown of each. Self-valorizing capital. This concept comes from Karl Marx's critique of capitalism. It refers to the idea that capital, money used to invest in production, has the ability to grow on its own through the exploitation of labor. In Marx's view, workers create new value through their labor, but capitalists capture a portion of that value as surplus. This surplus value is then used to reinvest and expand capital, leading to its self-valorization. Modern monetary theory. MMT is a heterodox economic theory that challenges some traditional economic assumptions. It argues that governments with their own fiat currency, like the US dollar, can spend without being limited by tax revenue. You know, that the saw that taxpayer dollars at work. MMT proposes that government spending can create demand and stimulate the economy, and inflation is the primary constraint on such spending. Now, the key difference is, you know, Gemini having given us two distinct definitions, it gives us at least the differences, not the D-I-F, D-I-D, F dash, etc. Focus, self-valorizing capital focuses on the dynamics of capitalism and the exploitation of labor. MMT focuses on government spending and its impact on the economy. But there is a connection. Of course, the role of money. In Marx's view, money, capital, is a tool used by capitalists to extract surplus value from workers. MMT views government spending as a way to inject money into the economy and manage inflation. No direct connection. That's Gemini's conclusion. MMT doesn't directly address the concept of self-valorizing capital or exploitation. It focuses on the mechanics of government spending in a fiat currency system. However, some MMT critics might argue that government spending can exacerbate wealth inequality if it benefits corporations and the wealthy more than workers. This could be seen as a continuation of the exploitation Marx critiques. It's important to note both MMT and Marxist theory are controversial and have their own sets of critiques. They offer contrasting perspectives on the role of money, capital, and government in the economy. Now, let me make a simple example here that suggests that they are connected, or more connected than you think. In the case of Ukraine, money has been allocated by the government, $60 billion in the U.S. government to transfer to spend for Ukraine. But in fact, they are spending on U.S. equipment made in the U.S., so they are actually an injection into the U.S. economy, into the U.S. regional economies, because production is not in one place, but in many different states, including many southern states. So hence, it was important from a pork barreling point of view to see that as a growth thing for the U.S. economy, even though the equipment is essentially meant to replace equipment transferred that is already existing in Europe in some cases to the Ukrainian army. So if you can follow that, you can see that, yes, there is a kind of connection. And yes, it does relate to American workers. There's a plant in Ohio, I think, that refurbishes Abrams M1 A1 tanks and converts them into M1 A1SA tanks. That's a kind of tank that is being Abrams tank that will be transferred to the Ukrainian military, of which they seem to have lost a fair number, which is problematic. All right, so the big enchilada, even though I've gotten towards the end of my time, capitalism and repetition. Let me start at the beginning of this. The idea of repetition is also related, of course, in terms of iteration, etc. If we looked at Department 1 and Department 2, things are being repeated. Certain processes are repeated. So we go from the first moment of production that moves to distribution, that goes blah, 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 that gets sold, and then you get money and blah, blah, and then it all comes back. You get repetition in the cycle. So this whole razzmatazz that I've been talking about in circuits of capital engages in a circuit is a kind of repetition. That's what happens. The energy flows in a circuit and repeats often in the same voltage being shot through the wires, let's say. The research article offers a Lacanian reading of the thesis according to which Marx's general formula of capital introduces the principle of repetition. Now, this is French stuff, right? This is the, what the New Left wrought. That is, you have a rereading of Marx in the post-Stalinist era, and you have a whole bunch of folks looking around and re-examining Marx's text, including the newly discovered text, to think about, well, we certainly don't want to go in the Stalinist direction. We've got to go into something that is a lot more humane. So there are a variety of writings that haven't tried to interpret Marx in this kind of way. And yes, you can make the analogy to the Bible and Reformation and blah, 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 but it's not quite as inerrant and doesn't require quite so much faith. I think it tries to stick around reality. So anyway, Capitalism and Repetition, an article by Simon Hagini on Marx and Lacan. Lacan being that French psychoanalyst that we were talking about before. Deleuze, however, Deleuze and Guattari are two guys who died probably too soon, but they developed a way in which you could apply certain principles, psychoanalytic principles, to capitalist society, that capitalism itself is a kind of madness, as it were, and you sort of needed to work through what kinds of pathologies make people the way they are. You could say that Trump is a classic example of a kind of a pathology. For example, the fact that he's just nuts, but the nuttiness comes from building on his particular brand of capitalism. Anyway. Deleuze, however, immediately moves on to link repetition to theft and gift, which are altogether withdrawn from circulation and thus escape the laws of exchange and are attainable only through their transgression. Let me stop there and say that theft and gifts still have markets. We can divide the economy into a sort of conventional economy where we sort of recognize, trade relationships in a fairly normal sort of way, but then there's an entire informal economies, what's called informal economies, criminal networks, money laundering, etc., that are in fact an informal economy, and the relationship between the informal and the formal economy often comes together in the form of corrupt government officials, as we've seen. I hope that you've seen. Theft and gift are two types of certain types of relationships. And in anthropological literature, we could say, you're stealing property, right? And your attempt to do it or your right to do it, of course, is an interesting kind of question. And since it violates custom or violates culture, does all kinds of things. So Vladimir Putin is essentially stealing Ukraine. So there's theft at that level. but then there's theft at the ground level. Russian soldiers who are not making a whole fuckload of money are, um, looting, pillaging, taking washers and having them shipped back uh, via their version of FedEx or whatever, DHL, to their homes. So it's just amazing that washers are that kind of commodity. But anyway, and gifts are a problematic element too, as Titmus mentions in his discussion of the blood bank market. It is a interesting kind of productive gift, particularly since homeless folks often use that as a way of generating capital. That is to give blood, plasma, whatever. So it is not so much withdrawing from circulation and escaping the laws of exchange. Rather, they are engaging in transgression on these kinds of things. And it's unfortunate that at scale they are capital, and that you have cops running around trying to stop this or police it, whatever. The paper shows why Marx couldn't agree with such a conception of repetition in its object, and why such a conceptualization is not radical enough. So that's kind of interesting. Marx's wager is to think repetition in its surplus object beyond mere transgression, and think also beyond the economy of gift and theft. And that's kind of where we're headed as sort of post-Keynesian materialists, is to think about, well, it's not simply a simple transgression, gift and theft, but it's a much bigger deal, because, as I've just said, the informal economy is clearly related to the regular economy, and we only discover them in these kind of really wacky sort of ways, where people who give money to certain political campaigns are discovered, in Florida, for example, to have used funds from their offshore bank in the Bahamas. And just coincidentally, these same banks are used to process the proceeds from online adult entertainment. So there's an entire interesting subnetwork that, and the fact of the matter is that it all the way comes back to buying politicians. And so that's sort of the interesting way in which some of these work. Now, that's sort of low class in that sense. Whereas you could do it via using real estate, which is what some people do in Florida. So there are keywords: capital, enjoyment, fetishism, ideology, perversion, and repetition. Fetishism, of course, is the more technical version in terms of commodity fetishism that Marx talks about. The thesis according to which Marx's general formula of capital introduces the principle of repetition can only seem a complacent commonplace. For it is immediately evident, as I've just pointed out, that the formula M-C-M prime implies repetition. First, the repetition of money as a qualitatively homogeneous thing that presents its starting point and its concluding moment, and then hence also the repetition of the act of exchange, which first takes the form of a purchase, a metamorphosis of money into a commodity, and in a second step, this is Department 2, the form of a sale, a metamorphosis of a commodity back into money. So there's repetition. If we abstract from the forms of commodity and money, the act of exchange effectively amounts to a repetition of the act of purchase. Buy more, which first takes place as a purchase of a commodity with money, and then as a purchase of money with a commodity. So you can see that this exchange is very important in order to get everyone to work together. Now, I won't wander on further, because I've used a significant amount of my time, and we need to prep for after hours. And later tonight, there is a Twilight Zone episode. I think there will be an episode of The Prisoner. We will see, among other things. So that will get us all the way up to probably close to 11 o'clock. Other things are occurring. This and that will be back at 3 o'clock on Saturday, with a 3 o'clock weekly Marx on Sunday. So, and back to 5 o'clock daily during the week. There's a writing thing at 2 o'clock tomorrow. There will be music and other matters on Saturday. There will be a episode of Columbo on Sunday. Um, and Lane will give us more really fun music on Sunday evening. So that gives us your weekend. If you're a Democrat, you're in total chaos and turmoil. So that's probably what mainly is going to be discussed. So I think come back. You know, we're going to be here for a while. Twilight Zone starts at 8:30. If John's here, perhaps you want to tell us about Twilight Zone tonight, John? John is not here. Uh, evidently engaged in other matters. So anyway, we have been in the evenings looking at episodes of The Prisoner in production order. Just simply to, if we're really being auteur theorists, that's kind of what we should be looking at it in, and in an empirical way. And so that's the rest of the evening